Okay, we're here with Eusebio from the University of Baltimore. And thank you for coming to Arizona State University. We're very lucky to have you in the Society Policy and Engineering Collective as our host this week. We met at ICMB, the International Conference of Mobile Business, I think in 2005, and were brought
Correct.
together by this beautiful woman by the name of Elaine Lawrence. And Elaine was the head of school of information technology at the University of Technology, Sydney, where I'm an alumni. But I didn't know her at the time I was going through UTS. She was working in the Ku-ring-gai office. And my first memory of you was having a whole lunch session dedicated to a literature review you did on mobile commerce or something like that. Do you remember that?
Yes.
What was it?
Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be collaborating with you and to be here in Arizona State. What I did was a project that I started when I was at Victoria University in New Zealand. I started the idea to create a database for mobile business literature. So that, back then you didn't have Google Scholar, so what I did was I got all the honors students that were working with me or with other colleagues that were doing research in mobile, and I made an offer they couldn't refuse. I said, listen, I get free pizza and drinks. We come here on a Saturday. I have all this literature that I have collected. I had over 500 papers that were coming, and mobile was very emergent, and I did a paper that actually ended up being a milestone in the field of mobility because it actually looked at the first 5 years of what was being published, really the state of the art and setting a research agenda. So I managed to transform that into a accessible database that for the community to be able to know what's happening and actually compiling not only from journals but the main conferences and so forth. So in Sydney in 2005 we had a lunch session where I was presenting MLIT was called.
Yes.
And that was one of the let's say focus points of the community to be able to share that information and to be able to really cross some, because we had different groups. We had, for example, the Mobility Roundtable, we had the ICMB, and later I was into the standing committee of both, and we managed to merge those two, which made sense because those communities was looking exactly the same kind of technology and the same kind of disruption.
Well, ICMB went very strong, but that 2005 conference, I remember, had all people from all nations. We had a lot of people from Asia, Japan in particular. I remember there were quite a few. But ICMB went very strong. It was in Barcelona, in Greece later on, and that community stuck together for a good 5 years, very, very close-knit. It's still going.
The community went for, basically, we had the first one, was in Athens in 2002, and we had the first Mobility Roundtable in Tokyo in 2002. And George Diaglis was the chair of the standing committee up to 2007. And I took from 2007 and went all the way to 2015. One of the things that happened was that a lot of the research in mobile became mainstream. We had a very strong European focus on that we didn't see as much coming from the US. We had the Asians and the Europeans, especially when Nokia was. So we get the Swedes and the Finns and so forth.
I remember.
And then we also had a change on the funding of the European Union. So, for example, Greece was a country that we used to have, 7, 8, 9 PhD students, and it started to dry. But also mainstream conferences that never had something in mobile was actually kind of incorporating that. So what we did, we had the last one in Berlin as a standalone conference. Then we moved as a pre-ISIS conference because there was the whole issue of funding to go to conferences and so forth. And then we decided that that would make more sense now to run in different conferences as a track. And that's basically what happened over time.
So, as an observer, in 2005, I had 2 papers in that conference that was hosted with Elaine Lawrence, and those papers remain my highest cited papers. We're talking in the 400s plus now, which shows the stealth of conferences. Sadly, the academic model is to move away from conferences, just to put your work in high peer-reviewed papers. But in fact, we were first movers at the time.
Absolutely.
And the paper I wrote on the Internet of Things at the time, and how businesses and consulting firms were taking on board this IoT concept, which is now gone ballistic, right?
Yeah.
But we were there when it was all happening, right at the nascent stages.
Yeah.
And so how does it feel to be 15 to 20 years ahead of what most people are doing?
Feels good, to be honest. Like, for example, the other day I have a couple projects in China that we're looking at trust mechanisms. And basically today in China, you cannot make a payment without Alipay or WeChat Pay, which basically uses barcode. I have a paper that I wrote in 2004 talking about how we can develop business models using barcodes to interact physical and cyber or digital artifacts.
Yes.
The whole idea of ubervalence that you were going back then. So what is the key issue is that a lot of times this kind of emerging research finds a home at conferences, and usually specialist conferences.
Yeah.
And later, it takes quite a bit of time for mainstream to accept that. A lot of times say that, oh, that's not, a phenomena or this and that. So a lot of times when you have this bad habit of looking at technologies and actually be able to foresee things 10, 15, 20 years ago, whether it was this idea of mobile. For example, in my case, I moved to Japan in 2001,
right,
because I believed that e-commerce, the future of it was mobile,
right,
and actually the only place that really had that was Japan. So I ended up,
let
me go there and see what's happening. All right, so I spent 2 years there. So the price you pay to a certain extent is that you never get bored.
Yes.
But on the other hand, to never get bored, the price you pay is actually to have a research that has a difficulty to go into mainstream. And whatever it is, now we're talking a lot of, for example, algorithm delegation, we're talking about social impact, and I'm seeing early signs to mainstream to kind of, you know what, we may need to think about that.
Maybe it's important.
Maybe it's important. Maybe something, there's something in there, right? The other day, I had a colleague, because I've been giving talks in different places, and said, Eusebio, mobile is the future. And I was like, it has been for 25 years.
Right.
But it's interesting. It's interesting that the key element that I find is that overall, because there is such a focus on the artifact, there is this overview that the research should be focused mostly on the artifact, and therefore what I call the disruptor,
right,
rather than focusing on the disruption that artifact is creating. So once you don't really care about what is the technology, but what the affordances of the technology are creating in terms of value, in terms of implications, in terms of positive effects and negative effects, I think it's something that really it doesn't. There's no an expire date on that. So I think that's the key element here. I think is a lot of times you see people saying, I do mobile, I do blockchain, I do AI. But I think what you should be saying is, I do disruption.
Right. And here in the School for the Future of Innovation in Society, we believe the school is disruption or a disruptor.
Yeah.
And having worked with some of our colleagues at King's College London, for example, through the Plus Alliance, Christina Arcady made the same point to me. She said something along the lines of, in February this year, forget the artifact. She says, what's the story? She's just studying virtual worlds. And she says, what's the storyline? What's the narrative? What's the scenario? What's the future?
Exactly.
And then we can shape whatever system we build towards that sort of striving for those goals, those positive goals.
I agree that the school is a disruptor, and I'll tell you why. One of the things that I've been talking to different people in different areas, what I mean, not only disciplines, but around the world, is that if we look at the structure of universities, we are basically set to fulfill the needs of a post-war industrial society.
Right.
And what we have, especially with digital, is a permeability of the phenomena to new areas that actually is really impacting the way, for example, you look at human behavior, you look at issues, for example, on society, you look at issues on technology, you look at, for even though I reside at the moment at a business school, and within the business school was very interesting. The only people that would come and talk to me were people from information systems or maybe decision sciences.
Yeah.
Now I have a line of people from accounting, marketing, strategy, human organizational behavior, HR, saying, Eusebio, can we have a chat? And I say, sure. But what is interesting is that there is an issue that a lot of times we are looking at the same object, but we end up going to different, I call it's almost like a religious issue that we look at the same object, we agree, say the same God and things like that, but then we end up having different prophets and holy books.
Yes.
And within that, we end up going to our own temples. And then if you're saying, well, this technology is doing that, then hold on a second. Who are you citing? Which book are you citing? Can you come? So we end up having this issue of much more a alignment within a discipline of the discussion, rather than saying what kind of conversations we want to have, what kind of discussions we want to join, and how those discussions will actually be enhanced by a multidisciplinary view. I'll give you just an example of how rich this can be. I'm running real-life cases around the world. Basically what I do, I have a program that I designed that I take usually 14 students to go to countries like Ghana or Finland or France, and they go work with companies. And a lot of times the students go and ask me, I'm an accounting major, can I come? The other one says, I am, for example, I have one that said, I am a public management major, can I come? And I say, yes.
Please
why?
don't.
Because the thing is, the company is going to give you a problem. And the problem, because I'm working with startups, the problem is actually a problem that is holistic and systemic. So not even what is valuable there is actually what major they are doing, but their life trajectory brings a level of richness to the discussion. And that the more, when I look at their CVs, because I select those students that apply, I look at those trajectories and how they collectively they're able to enhance the discussion and actually provide a better solution. So I think that what I find very interesting of the proposition that you have here is actually is bringing people that in, let's say, natural conditions of the organizational structure of knowledge and so forth will probably never get together, even though they're talking about the same issue and actually interested on the same phenomenon.
And this is like the brainchild of our president, Michael Crow, alongside supported by our director, Dave Guston, and Daniel Sarowitz in the DC office of CISPO, the Consortium for Science Policy Outcomes. But there's something about the school, right? 50 disciplines, 38 faculty, and it just shows you the rich discussions we are having, just like the one we're having right now. We come from these different viewpoints and lenses, and it sort of crunches together. It reminds me a little bit of the stuff that when I was working at Nortel, my director hired 8 people in his team, and 8 people had different skill sets. There was an economist, a geologist, a botanist, an IT person, a teletraffic theory, telecommunications person, and so forth, and so, a mathematician. And we worked brilliantly, complementing each other, but also melding in method and ontology. Now, there's something about people that can fit into a role like that. And my boss, my immediate boss, senior manager, was Jean-Luc Thibault, a French-Canadian, whom I still adore and mention in most of my classes. And he used to say to me, you know what, Katina, we're global citizens. And I used to think as a ripe 20-year-old, 21-year-old, what does he mean, global citizen? You know, what is that? Is that because, he said, we need a global passport. He used to talk about that because we traveled continuously. Now, I don't think I've met a match of Jean-Luc Thibault and his travels, but then there's you. Firstly, I want to know, do you think, you know, it takes a special kind of person to fit in a school like SFIS? Or how do we move towards a model of interdisciplinarity?
I think there is a few things that need. The first thing is to have the ability to understand the different points of view and see how they actually add. So actually, instead of looking what makes us different from each other, looking what actually makes us similar. And I think if you go and you look at the people that you have involved into this idea, into this concept, the list of things we have in common is probably 3 times longer than the things we have that makes us different.
Right.
So instead of shifting the focus from, you come from engineering, you come from sociology, it's like, hold on a second, what do we have in common? And I think that the people that have the ability to look at first what we have in common and actually see what we have in different, how that actually adds value to the conversation, I think that's the first thing that will do. The second thing I find that there is important here is to make sure that whatever we set as the expected outcomes are actually flexible and broad to understand the impact that each discipline may have, the way impact is perceived into a different way.
Right.
One of the issues that you have when you look at in some disciplines, there is a very strong push for rankings, and those rankings are about publications in certain journals that are part of certain lists, and those lists sometimes are geographically bounded, sometimes not. So it makes a bit more difficult when you have the actual system trying to say, okay, I will have a multidisciplinary conversation, but on the other hand, you have actually the expected, let's say, KPIs, the key performance indicators, bounded to disciplines, and that becomes very difficult. For example, I just did a paper on binge watching, which actually is a paper that's not into information systems or into management. It's actually on media and communications. Why? Because it made more sense to join that conversation.
Yes.
About the issues, how to actually understand binge watching, what are how do we classify it, and so forth. So I think this freedom of understanding how an output, whether it is a conversation like this, or whether it is a publication or a talk, how does actually create real impact.
That's right.
Versus simply, how many points on whatever rank and so forth. So I think you need this alignment between the proposition of this multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary organization and the way that people will be held accountable for their productivity and so forth.
So, we believe exactly the same. And I think who is open to this kind of structure? What kinds of academics actually see beyond the ranking lists and, feel happy at the end of the day? When we pass away one day, hopefully it's a long time into the future, we're not going to see on our tombstone had, 15 or 20 A-star papers. And I often say this to students, yes, you must hit at least one of these, in the next 5 years. But what else are you going to do? How else are you going to contribute? How is the real public value and public impact? And I go back to you, okay? Just like Jean-Luc Thibault, whom I've mentioned here in memory. And you always correct me. I always say, 5 foreign languages, but then you say to me, no, it's 7. Now, is it 7?
Yes, it is.
Tell me about that.
So my first language is Italian. So I grew up speaking Italian till I was 5. Then I went to school in Brazil. So then I got Portuguese there. I was very lucky. I went to a Jesuit school that we had a fantastic education. We, so for example, philosophy was taught from 6th or 7th grade, and we had a very broad, not only on sciences but also humanities, with theology and sociology. That was also so. As one of the jokes was that I went to college before going to high school, and there I also learned a bit of French and Spanish and English. Then when I was a teenager, I went on a scholarship here to the U.S. and I did my high school in Wisconsin. And then I went back to Brazil. I started college and started studying German. Then I went to do part of my studies in Germany. So at that point, I was already speaking Italian, Portuguese, English, Spanish, French, and German. And then I went back. I did part of my studies in the U.S. And that was already the tipping point that I was looking into what I'm going to do in my life. And I was already started to work with research. I think when I was like 22 years old, I already had 18 or 19 publications or something like that. Wow. And I decided that I was studying electronic commerce in my master's, or better, information intermediation in the cyberspace. That was the kind of lingo we used back then. And I made a decision that I would, instead of going straight to my PhD, which was the idea to come back here to the US, was to actually go to Japan to actually experience and do research into mobility. So what I did was I started to study Japanese. I applied for a fellowship from the Japanese government, basically Minister of Education and Science, got that fellowship, and then moved to Japan, and that is the 7th language.
Japanese,
yes.
Right? Very different from the others.
It is. It was very challenging, especially the writing system, and it was part of the idea to me. I thought about, okay, what if I finished my PhD at the age of, 27 and not have lived in Asia for 2 years?
Yes.
Or if I lived in Asia and learned a Asian language. Of course, Japanese is very different from Chinese. A bit, there is some similarity to Korean, but just experience to live there and then to do research into an area. So that's how I did. But one of the things that was interesting is that on my youth, I was linked to the Rotaract, which is a youth branch of the Rotary. And I was secretary for Latin America. Right. So what I did was also, during my holidays as a college student, I used to travel visiting clubs around the world. Basically, I went to the entire Americas, North Africa, Europe. And what was interesting was that ability to stay with people and really, with the languages and so forth, really get to understand them. So part of this whole global, how can I say, engagement that I have today in all the projects and all the, like for example, next week I am flying to the Mediterranean Conference, which I'm doing a doctoral consortium. Then I fly to Latin America, which I'm doing another doctoral consortium and a keynote. That is part of that background, to be able to actually bridge communities and actually have this sensibility to understand others' context. So it's something that I really enjoy, and I'm very proud of it. And I'm actually, by creating those real challenges, like I did, for example, in Finland, we end up in the first page of the news.
Yes.
So I can actually share that with my students. So that's, to be honest, that's what I call rewarding.
That's rewarding. It's what few people can actually do. You talk about crossing time zones all the day, multiple times a week sometimes, or within a month. You've gone to 4 or 5 places, and there are real projects on the other end.
Yeah.
People would be surprised, perhaps, that someone so articulate, someone so well-read, someone so well-versed in the world actually has begun with an engineering degree. Is that right?
I did. You're being too kind, by the way.
No, I'm not.
So I started doing mechanical engineering and management at the same time. And what happened was, towards the end of my engineering degree, and I was doing both, I actually won a national prize on social development. By the Kellogg Foundation, and basically that kind of shifted my main interest from, actually we developed a self-sustainable system for helping a charity that basically takes care of kids in let's say in social risk, and actually elderly people that were abandoned. So we created actually a greenhouse that was powered by basically organic matter, and actually that will work as a training center for the youngsters to actually get a profession, and for the older folk that were living there to actually do, have some activities that they would enjoy doing and so forth. Together. So that shifted my interest to actually more management than engineering. But at the same time, there was this new thing coming, which was the internet and electronic commerce. Yes. And then I focused completely on that.
So this is the interesting thing, right? Yeah. So most people working in the emerging technology space would be going cutting edge, and you are. I mean, I could ask you anything about any emerging technology, and you could say something about it, and beyond something. I mean, you could even point to applications of these technologies in the world. But you have tended to almost go down a continuum whereby you're reaching out still to developing nations. Yeah. And you are there at the well-developed and, more developed nations pressing on. What is there something that binds that? Like, how do you do that?
Well,
and which projects? Tell us about the projects intimately.
So I'll give you 2 projects that are, quite extremes. One project we're going, I have a good friend of ours that I'm partnering to go to Cameroon and look how we can use actually mobile technologies to empower entrepreneurial women. basically we're thinking in terms of how we can enhance their supply chain. They can coordinate efforts that those women that maybe they are making $2 or $3 a day, we can actually lift to $5 or $10 a day.
Right.
That can make a humongous difference on the quality of life of their families and even access to education of their children. So we're looking at the affordances of the ecosystem that is going there. But at the same time, I have a grant in Finland that we're looking at using mobile technology to actually teach financial literacy to youngsters. What is the problem? With the easy access to the technology, they also have access to easy credit. And that credit, you press a button to give you 100 euros easy, but what is forgotten there is that actually that credit may be on an extremely high interest. So what we're doing, we're using the same, let's go, vessel that is delivering the access of youth to, I would say, loan sharks. We're actually using the same vessel to actually empower them to actually get in digital literacy. Financial literacy.
Yes.
Because they already have digital literacy.
Yes.
So that's something that the idea here is to look at this affordance of technology, look at settings as developed as Finland, or with developing, on a developing path as Cameroon, to actually understand how those affordances can actually create public good. Another one, for example, in Ghana, which I'm going back now in January again, we work with a company that they're using text messages to actually validate the authenticity of medicine. I mean, you were talking about 150,000 deaths a year on counterfeit medicine in West Africa.
Yes.
And basically, they're using the technology to do that. In Brazil, for example, we're doing a project right now with people that basically work collecting recycled materials. And basically, if you want to say this, basically they're collecting garbage, they're collecting paper and cans, and actually they are co-oping, and they're using technology to coordinate that. Yeah. So we're looking into settings of restrained resources, and that's the beauty about that is actually you can see amazing level of innovation coming there. So my interest really is looking at how this digital revolution can actually, like you guys say, the future is for everyone. Well, that's kind of the idea. The other issues that to me right now is extremely pressing is to understand how digital awareness is affecting that. So it's not only to have access to technology, skills, but actually understanding what are the outcomes of actually having a digital connected life into that. So I think the what drives me, whether it's in Finland or Cameroon or in Singapore, for example, I'm partnering with a colleague in Singapore, another in Australia. We're looking at how the quality of drivers, basically on car Ubers, or how actually the changes in the structure of the algorithm is impacting their life quality. Yeah. So those are very interesting issues. So I'm interested into that, the disruption that the affordance of the ecosystem can do. So whether, and especially when you're looking at innovation, coming from settings that you don't really, is in your face, that's what drives me to go there.
I agree with you. I mean, I see everyday problems arise and challenges and dilemmas right in front of me. Yeah. People ask me, what's my source of inspiration? It's living. I'm embodied within a context and a situation in situ. And if you don't ask the questions, we're a bit dumb. I don't know how to say it. I visited the Australian National Museum with my 9-year-old when I was in Australia in June this year, and somehow bumped into my former head of school that was going to see an augmented reality show that was being viewed at the museum. And I said, well, as soon as my 9-year-old heard that, he said, I'm coming, I'm going, Mum. I said, let's go. So I took out my credit card to pay the cashier at the booth, and he said, I can take your money, but you can't go in. And I was very mesmerized. Like, why? Why can't I go in? He said, because the 9-year-old. And I said, and he thought he was going to be challenged, but I was not in the mood to challenging. I was in the mood to listening. So he said, well, he can't come in because the AR goggles and the motion will affect him. For under 15s, we are restricting this to an audience that is adult, right? 16 and above. And I said, that's okay. Can I interview someone? I want to talk to someone because this is the first time we've gone to many VR and AR experiences, and everyone's taken our money and nobody's blocked us at the door. So the question then was, I wrote to the manager of the museum. I got some communications. I followed up with Samsung, with Apple, with the people who built the AR Antarctica experience in Perth. And that's research, right?
Right.
Going through an ethics approval process whereby we can document why and how come this is not happening, for example, in a lot of the museums in Washington, D.C. They just let you go in, take your money and go, yes, there's $45 a pop. So this tends to a topic that is at the heart of the School for the Future of Innovation. It's public interest technology.
Yeah.
It's in public interest. And we have a new Masters of Science major in PIT that is coming through. And I think your work, right, lends itself to this ideological position. What's your take on what seems to be new but has always been PIT, public interest technology? What do you think about it? What do you think it constitutes?
I think the key element here is to look at it. Any technology that is introduced in society can actually make remarkable change. And whether we look at, not only digital, we look at through history, go back to, to even the Greeks, the Romans, you see certain technologies actually making change. And one of the things that I also think about is the more the ecosystem or technology evolves, it changes the portfolio of skills that we need to survive in society. And the question that I think we should be asking here is not necessarily whether can technology, for example, make a decision for me. I think it's much more important to ask, should we rely on technology to make that decision? Should we rely on certain technologies to do this? Or can we ask the help of technology to improve our process, but not forgetting the humankind that is actually the most important thing there. So I think a lot of times the element is to understand that the simply deployment or diffusion of a technology can have immense societal impact. And that societal impact a lot of times is not really clear until we are really living it. If you think about, we were talking about the idea of location-based services or the privacy issues. We were talking this 20 years ago, and now it's hitting the news.
Yeah.
Or so those issues is that now that is actually really effectively becoming a potential harm or problem we are now discussing. We should be looking at these things, more broadly. We should be looking at these things much earlier, and actually, looking at what is the actual value. And value doesn't mean performance gain. Value is how does it actually make life better for everyone.
So on that, the school has many specialists in the precautionary principle, in participatory design, in co-design, in public halls, in public engagement. All of these things are so important, but you talk rightly about before a technology is unleashed, how can we see how it may be used, misused, abused, beneficially used, positively impacting, and perhaps minimize those harms? People talk about technology assessments. The US was big on technology assessments in the 80s in particular. The environmental movement really pushed the precautionary principle in the 70s, and then IT latched onto this notion through a number of academics, including Rob Kling, who wrote widely about the precautionary principle. But there are other technologists and engineers who say you can't prejudge ethics, you can't preempt what's going to happen. So let it go. And those teething problems, we'll worry about them after the fact. Is there an optimal process? Have we yet to design that process? Is it values by design? Is it ethical alignment by design? Is it democracy by design? Is it privacy and security by design? What is it? Do we look at impact assessments like risk assessments, privacy impact assessments, cost-related assessments, child safety assessments, right? Social justice assessments, and then environmental impact assessments. The list goes on. And of course, there is something called the technology assessment as well that was used as a tool to navigate the introduction of emerging technologies. Whilst in China, it's we shall and we will get there.
Yeah.
And we need to think about a mass market, a large population, limited resources, financial and economic system indicators. But what is your take? How are we going to do this? What's the next 20 years going to bring in method, in approach?
I think one of the key issues here that we have is that there's not a lot of push into discussing this broadly as a society. So a lot of times what happens is we come straight to the value proposition in terms of the tangible benefit in terms of efficiency that the technology comes. So for example, if you use Google Maps, you get faster from A to B because, or ways you're going to avoid traffic or something like that.
Yes.
So I think a lot of times the key element here is that the discussions that basically creates this compass, whether we agree or we don't, that the risks of actually adopting or having this technology being part of our lives are actually acceptable in light of the benefits that this technology will provide are hardly ever discussed. What is really focused on in a very short term is simply what is the benefit. And sometimes those benefits are not necessarily utilitarian.
Yes.
Can be hedonic. For example, we had the other day the Face app that people were basically disclosing, given biometric data, because they wanted to see how they might look in X years, or if they lose 20 pounds or if they gain 20 pounds.
Yeah.
So you see, the benefit was not even a utilitarian benefit. No. It's actually just a hedonic benefit. But how many of the people that sign up and used actually stopped for a second and did that? Or, for example, DNA.
23andMe.
And so forth. Right? So I think the issue is that the key element is that I think a lot of times the discussion and the focus, especially if you come from an engineer or a business, the focus is how can we make technology do this? I think this is the engineer on me, and how cool would it be if we could do this? Right? Now the business, the person in a business school is looking, okay, how this will actually improve performance, customer satisfaction, basically increase the return on investment.
Profit maximization.
Exactly. Simple as that. Performance equals return on investment. The shareholders are happy, or the citizens, whoever is paying for that, and I think we need to look at another layer of that. And I think those discussions are a lot of times maybe siloed.
Yes.
And not really diffused across different disciplines. So I think by starting to put people that naturally with this post-industrial post-war industrial society will never sit in the same room.
Yes.
And actually, have you considered this thing? Have you looked at that? How this affects this? And bringing that into, I think then we are starting to actually having a good chance to think a little bit further. Of course, if we had a crystal ball, we would be able. We don't.
Yes,
I joke the day that they invented a good crystal ball, I'm out of my job. Right? That's my biggest fear in life. Like the goals. In Asterix had that the sky would fall. To me, is that somebody would invent a crystal ball.
And then forget it. You don't exist. You're not necessary.
But I think that's one of the things that those conversations, to look at those perspectives together. And I think that's, to me, something that we need to understand that now because of if you think about when you're looking into a digital ecosystem, the network effect and the generativity that the network, because the way we're connected and different things are connected, you have actually a snowball effect, a network effect that is much broader and faster than we ever had before. Yeah. So that's why we need actually to have this cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary discussions to really be able to bring that richness of perspectives, and I think then we have a better fighting chance on this.
So one of the things I've been thinking while you've been speaking is, I was asked recently about my parents. And whether they were educated or not. And really, I've always thought about them as educated because they're wise people, right? They have really good common sense. They've done a great job in raising me and teaching me certain values. And President Crow was asking all the new professors at a luncheon when I joined, who is the first from your family to go to university? Or is your generation, your siblings and yourself, one of the first to go to university? And I didn't put up my hand because I thought my parents were university educated, but they were educated through life experience, right? Post-World War II for my mother and World War II for my dad, as a young boy living through it without a mother and 5 siblings, 5 brothers. So it was like, what is it about academe, about schooling, about education, about literacy that's so important. And one thing that my parents did impose on us is love school, love to learn. We didn't have the opportunity. We're so sad we didn't in the village because there was no schooling. Schooling was interrupted, and then you had to fend for yourself to live and eat food. But I'm saying this as a preemption to the public. And I think being of second generation Greek Australian with migrant parents, I understand the value of the public really well because I saw their voice not through a business. They weren't entrepreneurs. I didn't see their voice through some community standing. I didn't see their voice in government. I didn't see their voice in other contexts like for not-for-profits even. What is it about the public, and what are we losing by not tapping in road mapping our future when we perhaps ignore the public? Like, we can't have a referendum to say location-based services for emergency management. We're not going to have a referendum for that. We're not going to collect door-by-door opinions on what people believe, because sometimes the feeling is, well, they don't even know what location-based services is, right? That digital awareness that you're talking about. So how do we respect diversity? And if we talk about inclusivity, and if we talk about the public, who is the public? Is it the homeless? Is it the single parent? Is it the parent who's a carer? Is it the person who is has a disability? Is the public the pensioner, the retiree? I'm concerned that we build for a certain demographic, we unleash and then start to try and chase what the problems are and fix them, while the builders are a certain demographic. We know this by searching bureaus of statistics, and predominantly white male, is what the statistics tell us, for example, in the US. How do we engage the public? Is it important? And where do you see this as a future potential for buying in terms of resource pooling, altruism, social capital, democracy?
Well, what is interesting is that right now at the University of Baltimore, for example, we in the country, we're actually one of the institutions with higher social mobility. And one of the things I actually enjoy when I'm teaching some of the courses is the deep diversity of my students. Right. I have the first generation American, I have the first generation college student, I have the veteran, I have the high school leaver, all in the same room. And that is actually, and when I bring companies, which I normally do, in every single course, I bring a company and I put a problem. What I don't want is the group of X, Y, and Z to be together. I want actually one group that has one X, and distribute that. Because I think if we create opportunity for engagement to hear the different perspectives, I think the solutions that we find are actually, to me, not only much more creative, innovative, but actually addressing a broader audience than when you have a siloed or let's say a biased. So, for example, if we look into digital awareness, that should be looking in at the early stages of education and actually providing and breaking some of the stereotypes. I'm also married to an engineer, the structural engineer, and I joke about, is very hard. The other day I brought a company in, which is a African American lady. She owns a software company in Maryland. And I used to tease Donna that she's my unicorn, because I to be honest, I don't know many that even that would have that profile. And what was interesting, when I brought her to my class to talk about her company and the problem that she was having, some of the young girls that were there, they were probably on juniors in undergrad. They automatically related to that, and actually you could see a boost in terms of interest into looking into technology and so forth. Right. So I think by being able to foster that, in looking in long term, is not something that I believe we're going to say, all right, now we are inclusive and we're good. Yeah. No, I don't think so. I think it's a long-term strategy to really understanding that what we have here is, if we don't really think on this, we actually have a divide, or a digital divide, that is actually growing further and further. that is not only on access to information, skills to use technology,
Yes.
but actually understanding the awareness of how this technology is impacting your daily life. And I think that's a very risky situation to me.
I think ASU espouses the diversity. We have a similar demographic here at ASU, and it's about lifting people. It's not about
Absolutely.
locking people out of education. And President Crow keeps saying, education is what's going to cause this inclusivity all the time. Exactly what you've said, which is wonderful. I do think it is a long-term process that we need to work, and it's a huge challenge in America from what I've seen in various states I've visited. You know, go to places like Boston and New York,
Baltimore,
right? DC, just outside, in Virginia, and I think it's something for us as academics to be proud of through this inclusivity.
But one of the things, I think I know you well enough that probably one of the things that we really get a kick out of our jobs
Yes.
is when we see a student arriving in their undergrad, and then you look at them at 10 years later and what they're achieving. For example, I have one, say like Misho, for example. He came to New Zealand as a refugee, as a child refugee from Fiji. He's Indo-Fijian.
Yes.
His dad basically drove a cab. The idea of going to university was actually, Michel was living today in London doing, consulting at the Sky Networks. So he started as my tutor. Then he went, did honors with me. Then he went to master's, which we got him to Media Lab. Then he started working to Telstra. Then went to Australia, to London. I mean, he's achieving something that as a kid that arrived in, as an Indo-Fijian refugee to New Zealand, would never imagine that he was saying, he doesn't even imagine he would be going to university.
Yes.
So being able to foster that is probably one of the most rewarding things in our jobs. That is and there, how many initials do you have? How many students that you can think of? How much you made a difference? So once you understand the power of education, of actually, and I'm not talking about how much money they're making.
No,
but the way that is actually make a difference in the trajectory of their life, in the life of their kids.
Yeah.
It's absolutely fantastic.
I think you've nailed it. I mean, I look back on international students who've come hardly knowing English, on students from the Middle East, for example, who were really looking for a new chance, and now in high positions. What's amazing, Eusebio, is that when I look at these students and I try to keep abreast of what they're doing, they far exceeded me about 10 years ago. And so I say to them, can you be my mentor? And it's true. But I love that. I love that. I love that.
Absolutely.
I love that.
But that's the thing that is extremely rewarding is to see, the how much your job, had an impact on people's or communities, trajectories, and that is absolutely fantastic. And to be honest, for example, when you see an international student, I joke with them. I said, I was second language 5 times in my life. so I went to kindergarten. I was like, well, Portuguese. What do we do now? And I did that, in the U.S. I studied English before going to high school here, but so I joke. And the same thing in Germany and Japan. And so I joke. I was a second language student 5 times in my life. So I really get it. How that happens, But even though, for example, I'm on a board of a company in Maryland that it's called Transitioning You. It basically is a app, is a digital environment for first generation college students.
Right.
And one of the things that we're doing that, and I'm very proud to be part of this, is that they're using research from one of the founders of the company to look at success factors for first generation college students. And there is a certain knowledge that when you don't have parents and you're not in a community that everybody went to college, that you don't really know how to succeed there. Right. So actually, they try to help to organize that information, and so it's a very interesting company that that they're supplying services to quite a few universities, but doing exactly that, increasing the success of those students because they are opportunity seekers. Yes. And when you can facilitate that, and what I call the aha moment, they go, I don't want to do this for the rest of my life. Yeah. It's pretty awesome. It's a joy. Yeah.
So that's why, we're closing to the end of the interview, but that's why I really love my parents. I mean, my mother got on a boat at 17, traveling to Australia alone, and there's a photo of her with her father at the port.
Yeah.
And she was 17. My grandfather was quite young, and I always used to say, "Now, who's that handsome young man before you met Dad? Who is it?"
Yeah.
And Mum says, "That's my dad. You know,
Yeah.
that's your grandfather."
Yeah.
But at 17 to have the guts, because it was about opportunities. They didn't
Yeah.
have the apps. They
Yeah.
didn't have the education. They just had the heart, Eusebio, and the hope.
My father was 14 when he immigrated, and
14 to Brazil?
Yeah, but he had his father came first, and then but even and then my mother and they actually met in Brazil, but they were from the same community, and you know you would say goodbye, and you would probably never see your grandmother again.
Yes.
You know, it's a different world. When I actually went back, I go back to Italy 2 or 3 times a year because I do visitorships there, and I was able to take my kids back.
Wow.
And they were looking at at their trajectory and thinking they were born in New Zealand, now they live in the U.S. The mother's Japanese. It's a long story, but they were able to go there and say, "Who is this? This is your great grandmother. This is your grandmother when she graduated, school there and so forth." And I think to see all these trajectories of people that one day determined, it doesn't need to be that you were immigrant. I mean, I immigrated to New Zealand, I immigrated here, but it's not only the immigration first, but somebody that decided, I'm the first in my family that I'm going to do this, or whether go to college, and seeing especially, for example, adult learners, the sacrifices that they are doing.
Huge.
That's absolutely fantastic.
So we get to continue this conversation in a faraway sort of way while we're remote. It's going to be through the IEEE Transactions in Technology and Society, of which you are co-editor. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you.
And I'm looking forward to receiving those great papers, right?
Yeah, I mean
20 years in advance of any other outlet. And to do that with you and the 4 other co-editors is going to be really top fun.
No, I think it's the initiative, and I want to congratulate on that. I'm honored to be part of it. I think we are creating a forum for actually thinking of impact, real impact, not necessarily citation indexes.
Yes, and I hope we get both.
Yeah.
Thank you, Eusebio, for visiting us.
It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.